Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating dynamic that literally every modern organization faces. We call it the corporate tightrope. For the longest time, there was this stubborn old school myth that businesses exist for one reason and one reason only, to make money. You build a product, sell it, maximize shareholder profit, and call it a day. But as we're going to see mapped out in today's source material, that outdated view just doesn't hold up in the real world anymore. Modern organizations are walking a seriously delicate tightrope, trying to balance profit, ethics, and governance all at once. To understand exactly how companies actually survive this tightrope, we're going to look at 6 key areas. First, the social contract. Then, the CSR debate, followed by the morality of business. After that, we'll hit ethics in accounting, the guardrails of governance, and finally, we'll look at the specific realities of governance in Nigeria.
Okay, let's dive right into this with Section 1, the social contract and understanding corporate obligation.
So, corporate social responsibility, or CSR, the standard definition is that it's the voluntary obligation of a corporate body to seek actions that protect and improve the welfare of society right alongside its own interests. The absolute key word here is voluntary. True CSR goes way, way beyond what's strictly prescribed by law or union contracts. It's the whole shebang, encompassing broad economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic duties to the entire community.
And it's really fascinating to track how this concept has evolved over time. Back in Phase 1, the early days of social responsibility, the focus was incredibly narrow. It was literally just about the owners, the shareholders, and maximizing that profit. But then we moved to Phase 2. Managers realized, hey, we need to attract and keep good talent, so the circle expanded to include employees, focusing on working conditions and job security. Then in Phase 3, it widened yet again to include all stakeholders. This meant fair prices and quality for customers, plus fair relationships with suppliers. And finally, we arrive at Phase 4, where the focus expands to society at large. Today, management recognizes a fundamental responsibility to advance the public good and protect the environment. That circle of social responsibility has just continuously expanded. Does business actually have a duty to society, or is that someone else's job? Let's look at Section 2, the CSR debate, duty or distraction. This debate represents a massive core tension in modern business. On one side, advocates for CSR argue that since businesses actually create a lot of today's social problems, they should step up and actively help solve them. By improving the community, a business naturally benefits from a better workforce and better consumers. Plus, taking voluntary action usually discourages heavy-handed government regulation. And honestly, it's often way cheaper to prevent social problems now than to try and cure them later. Conversely, critics argue that a business's primary task is purely economic. From this angle, social activities just sidetrack managers from maximizing profit, which drags down economic efficiency. Furthermore, who actually pays for these social programs? Well, those costs are ultimately passed right back to us, the consumers, through higher prices. Finally, many argue that business leaders are trained in economics, not sociology. They just lack the specific social skills to effectively solve complex societal issues. It brilliantly illustrates the tension between building a better society and maintaining economic efficiency.
So, why do good managers sometimes do bad things? That brings us to Section 3, the morality of business, the human element.
Well, it really all comes down to business ethics. This refers to the individual and corporate standards of truth, justice, and moral principles that guide actions beyond just the basic requirements of the law. It's super important to note that an organization's ethical climate isn't just pulled out of thin air. It's actually shaped by personal ethics, the stuff we learn from our parents, schools, and the media, combined with the actual organizational culture and its internal decision-making processes. When there's a breakdown in these standards, the consequences are incredibly severe. In fact, research points out a truly shocking metric. Unethical behavior can actually add more than 20% to the cost of doing business. No joke. And we aren't just talking about corporate fines here. We're talking about massive, hidden, systemic costs to society. Things like low wages, unemployment, and poverty. Ethics isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. It has a literal, massive financial and human impact.
So, the crucial point is understanding how normally dedicated, totally honest employees slide into this kind of behavior. The research highlights 4 highly dangerous rationalizations. First, believing that no one will ever find out. Second, convincing themselves that the behavior isn't really illegal.
Third, telling themselves it's ultimately in the best interest of the organization. And fourth, believing that because they're doing it for the company, the organization will protect them if they ever get caught. These four rationalizations create an incredibly dangerous, slippery slope. But, these rationalizations don't just happen in a vacuum. What actually triggers them? Well, it often starts with immense pressure from the parent company to meet entirely unrealistic business objectives. When you combine that intense pressure with an employee's natural desire to protect their own livelihood or career, people start cutting corners. Add an ignorance of the consequences and a poor organizational culture that reduces every single decision to pure economics rather than ethics. Top all that off with a lack of consistent ethical leadership setting a terrible example, and you have a highly toxic mix. This is exactly how taking unethical shortcuts becomes the accepted norm. Now, let's shift focus to a specific profession heavily reliant on public trust. Section 4. Ethics in Accounting, the Professional Code. The accounting profession operates on a definitive, non-negotiable checklist of 5 ethical steps. Step 1 is integrity, meaning you're entirely straightforward and honest. Step 2 is objectivity, ensuring there's zero bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence in your work. Step 3 is professional competence and due care. Basically, you have to maintain up-to-date skills to actually give competent service. Step 4 is confidentiality, protecting client info and never, ever using it for personal advantage. And Step 5 is professional behavior, complying with all laws and avoiding any actions that discredit the profession itself. The stakes here are incredibly high. Breaching this code results in severe sanctions. We're talking everything from reprimands and massive monetary fines, all the way up to total suspension or permanent exclusion from the profession. So, how do we keep all of this in check? Let's look at Section 5, the guardrails of governance, enforcing the rules. Corporate governance is defined as the systems, processes, and structures by which the affairs of corporate entities are directed, overseen, and controlled. And the ultimate goal, to maximize long-term shareholder value legally, ethically, and on a sustainable basis. Think of governance as the ultimate oversight mechanism. It's the structural framework that holds executives accountable to everyone who has a legitimate stake in the organization, making sure they don't veer off that tightrope we talked about earlier. When an organization actually has these guardrails securely in place, the benefits are immense. Good governance ensures fairness and total transparency. It promotes independence and absolute honesty among the board and management. It establishes very clear lines of responsibility and accountability. And ultimately, these benefits enhance corporate reputation and foster sound judgment. Why does this matter to us? Because all these factors combined create intense investor trust. And that trust is absolutely critical for maintaining the financial solvency and the overall viability of the firm over the long haul. Now, what's really interesting is how this plays out in specific regions. That brings us to Section 6, Governance in Nigeria, Practice and Problems. The source material details several specific, really tough hurdles within the Nigerian corporate landscape. Governance here is frequently threatened by the poor integration of information technology and ineffective management information systems. There are also some serious issues regarding the questionable independence and transparency of auditors, which is often coupled with undue pressure from the government itself. You also see frequent disagreements between the board and management, which lead to incredibly distracting board squabbles. Add in passive shareholders, weak internal controls, and self-serving practices among leadership, and you can instantly see why establishing solid corporate governance is such an uphill battle in this environment. To combat these exact weaknesses, codes of best practice are used to standardize corporate leadership across 3 crucial areas. First, for the board of directors, the codes focus heavily on their roles, their responsibilities, and ensuring a balanced composition. Second, for reporting, the focus is squarely on maintaining pristine financial and narrative reporting, as well as rigorous auditing. And third, for operations, the codes provide strict guidelines for risk management, internal controls, and fair directors' remuneration. Now, in places like the UK, these guidelines are voluntary, though they're highly supported by major financial institutions. But in Nigeria, the entire approach is rapidly shifting. And this brings us to a major turning point, the Nigerian compliance requirements post-October 2016. The massive shift here is moving from voluntary guidelines to strict, mandatory compliance. The Corporate Governance Code is now mandatory for all public companies, whether they're listed or not. It's also mandatory for private holding companies and subsidiaries of public firms. Furthermore, it sets a very strict minimum of 8 members on a board of directors to ensure proper balance and prevent centralized, unchecked power. This regulation is effectively legally forcing companies to walk that tightrope of accountability. Which leaves us with a final, profound question to consider today. After everything we've explored, the expanding social contract, the ethical pitfalls, and the absolute necessity of structural governance, ask yourself this: will your company's pursuit of profit build a better society or just borrow from its future? How a business balances corporate social responsibility, strict ethics, and rigorous governance will ultimately dictate not just its quarterly earnings, but its true, lasting legacy. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep learning.